The call came in on a Tuesday, which I remember because Tuesdays were my long days out near the Brundage Formation, and I'd been on the road since before 5 in the morning. I had the truck windows down and the mesquite scrub rolling past on both sides of the county road, and the methane sensor was doing its thing in the passenger seat. Slow ambient read, nothing flagged, and I was more or less on autopilot when the field office number came up on my phone. I almost let it go to voicemail. I don't know why I didn't. The guy on the line was Hargrove, the operations coordinator. He had a way of talking that made everything sound like a scheduling problem, which I guess most things were from where he sat. He told me there'd been a find on the Delgado Ranch lease out past Encinal, 6 head of cattle, and that I was being pulled off the Brundage transect for the rest of the week. I asked him what kind of find warranted pulling a methane survey. He said the ranch foreman had reported the carcasses that morning and that Parks and Wildlife was already involved. Then he said the bone work was unusual and left it at that, like that explained anything. I pulled over on the shoulder and wrote down the coordinates he gave me. The sensor kept reading in the background. 62 parts per million, steady. Nothing to worry about. I sat there a minute after I hung up, looking at the numbers on my notepad, and I thought, unusual is a word people use when they don't want to say what they actually mean. I drove back toward Cotulla. I'd been running methane surveys through LaSalle County for 3 years by then, which sounds like a long time until you understand what the country out there does to your sense of time. It's dense mesquite and limestone and dry creek beds and not a lot else. And after enough months of it, you stop seeing it as scenery and start reading it the way you read a topographic map, looking for what's underneath, what's moving, what's off. I knew that stretch of land west of Cotulla the way most people know their own neighborhood. I knew where the seeps were likely to surface, which creek beds flooded first after rain, which limestone formations were solid and which ones had hollow space underneath that you could hear if you knocked on the right spot. 6 cattle carcasses wasn't inherently strange out here. Coyotes worked in groups, feral hogs would hit a water source if they found it, and a stock tank near a dry creek bed was exactly the kind of place you'd expect trouble. The number wasn't the thing. It was the bone work. That's what Hargrove had said, and that's what I kept coming back to on the drive. By the time I got back to the field office, Eliana Lee from Texas Parks and Wildlife was already on the phone with someone inside. I knew her by reputation. She'd flagged a colony of cave-adapted invertebrates the previous spring that had held up a drilling permit for 2 months, and the Pioneer guys had not been quiet about their feelings on that. I'd never actually met her. She was standing near the window with a notepad and wire-rimmed glasses and the specific kind of focused expression that means someone is listening hard and already thinking about what they're going to say next. Hargrove waved me toward the conference table and slid a printed photograph across it. I've seen a lot of dead animals in 3 years of field work. Deer, javelinas, the occasional steer that wandered into a bad spot. You get used to the general shape of it. What was in that photograph wasn't that. The carcasses were arranged in the creek bed in a rough cluster, which wasn't normal. Predators scatter things, they don't consolidate them. But the arrangement wasn't what stopped me. It was the bones. The femurs on at least 3 of the animals had been split lengthwise, clean, the way you'd split a log if you knew exactly where to put the blade. The marrow cavities were scraped out. Vertebrae, too. Same pattern. The kind of access that requires either a tool or something that functions like one. The cuts. And they were cuts, or something close enough to cuts that I don't have a better word, were parallel. Consistent spacing. I sat with that photograph for a while. Eliana Lee got off the phone and came to the table and introduced herself without a lot of ceremony. She had the photograph memorized already, I could tell, because she didn't look at it when she talked about it. She said she'd identified the pattern within 2 hours of getting the initial report. Femurs and vertebrae, she said, split and extracted with a degree of precision that didn't match any predator behavior documented in the region. Not coyotes, not hogs. She said it calmly. The way you say something you've already decided is true and don't feel the need to She recommended a follow-up field survey. Subsurface assessment, she said, because the creek bed sat above a limestone formation with documented cave potential, and whatever was doing this had to be coming from somewhere. That was when Stephen Payne walked in. I'd worked 4 surveys with Stephen over the past 2 years, and I want to be clear about what that means. 4 surveys in LaSalle County terrain is enough time to trust somebody's judgment in the field, which is a different kind of trust than most people understand. You learn how a person moves through rough country, how they read a formation, whether they panic when something goes sideways. Stephen didn't panic. He was 54 years old and had spent 20 years on the Edwards Plateau, and he had the particular confidence of someone who has been right enough times that being wrong doesn't really occur to him anymore. Big guy, silver gray hair, pale blue eyes that didn't miss much. He wore the same worn vest to every survey like it was part of his actual body. He volunteered to lead the follow-up personally, said he knew the Delgado lease terrain and could have a 3-person team assembled by morning. He requested me by name. He also requested Summer Parker, a junior field tech I'd worked with twice. Good instincts, sharp eye for environmental detail, the kind of person who notices things quietly and doesn't make a production of it. I registered the volunteering. That's the honest thing to say. Stephen Payne was experienced enough that he didn't have to volunteer for anything. He could have assigned a team and stayed in the office. The fact that he didn't landed somewhere in the back of my mind and sat there. Not quite a question. Not quite nothing. But I'd trusted him through 4 surveys. That kind of trust doesn't dissolve over a small thing, and this read as a small thing. A senior man who wanted to stay sharp, maybe, or who had enough professional pride not to send junior people into unfamiliar terrain without covering them himself. That was the read I settled on. I accepted the assignment. Summer Parker showed up at the field office an hour later with her pack already loaded, which told me she'd been called before I had. She nodded at me across the room and started checking her equipment without being asked. Headlamps, survey flags, the signal kit with the flare gun, her rock hammer clipped to the outside of the pack, methodical. I liked that about her. We were scheduled to move at first light. I sat in my truck in the field office parking lot that evening and ate a gas station sandwich and thought about the photograph, the parallel grooves in the bone, the consistency of them. I'd spent 3 years reading this country, and I had a decent working knowledge of what lived in it and what it was capable of, and I kept arriving at the same place. That kind of precision doesn't happen by accident, and it doesn't happen fast. Whatever made those marks knew what it was doing. It had done it before. I didn't sleep well. That's not a complaint, just a fact. Some things you can't unknow once you've seen them. And a photograph of 6 cattle femurs split open with that kind of deliberate, patient accuracy is one of them. We got out to the creek bed a little before 7. The light was still low and flat, coming in sideways through the mesquite, and the ground was dry enough that our boots raised a fine white dust with every step. Caliche country. You get used to it after a while, the way it coats everything. Your boots, your hands, the inside of your nose by mid-morning. Payne set the pace. He always did. He moved through the brush like a man who had been moving through brush his whole life, which he had. And he kept his eyes down on the ground in front of him without looking like he was looking for anything in particular. That was the thing about Payne. He always looked casual, even when he wasn't. Summer was working the east side of the creek bed while I ran the west. Standard transect protocol. We were flagging any disturbance to the soil, any drag marks, anything that looked like it didn't belong. The carcasses had already been removed by the time we got there. Dr. Lee's team had taken them for analysis 2 days prior. So what we were working with was absence. The shapes where things had been. The ground compressed in ways it shouldn't be compressed. I flagged a drag mark about 30 yards upstream from the original find site. The soil was disturbed in a long, shallow furrow, maybe 8 or 9 feet, and the edges of it were clean in a way that bothered me a little. Coyotes drag things, sure. Feral hogs will move a carcass. But the edges of a drag mark left by an animal are ragged. You get claw prints. You get the animal's own tracks cutting into the furrow where it repositioned its grip. This was more like something had been slid, deliberately. I marked it with a flag and noted the GPS coordinates and kept moving. That's the thing about survey work. You develop a kind of tunnel vision after a while, which is mostly useful and occasionally the exact wrong thing. You get locked into your transect line and you stop seeing what's outside it. I had been doing this for 3 years and I still hadn't fully broken that habit. Summer broke it for me. She called out from the base of the limestone bluff on the north side of the creek. Not loud, just enough to carry. "Hey, come look at this." Payne was closer to her than I was. I watched him change direction without hurrying and walk toward her, and I followed. The bluff wasn't tall, maybe 25 feet of exposed limestone, pale and fractured, with a dense skirt of prickly pear and cenizo at the base. I had walked past it twice that morning and registered it as a bluff and moved on. That's what I mean about tunnel vision. Summer was crouching at the base when we got to her. She pointed up at the rock face. There was caliche dust on the limestone. Fresh dust, still pale and powdery, not yet settled into the surface the way old disturbance does. It was spread across a section of the bluff maybe 4 feet wide, at roughly chest height, like something had pressed against the rock there or been dragged across it recently. And below that, in the soft dirt at the base of the bluff, there were boot prints. I crouched next to Summer and looked at them. Lug sole, medium treadwear, probably a size 10 or 11. More than one set, maybe 2, overlapping in a way that made it hard to count. They led toward a narrow vertical fissure in the rock face, half hidden behind a thick stand of prickly pear that I had not pushed through to look behind. "Survey flags?" Summer asked. "No," Payne said. I looked at him. His face was reading neutral, which was the face he used when he was thinking hard about something and didn't want you to see it. I had worked with him long enough to know the difference between that and actual calm, and I was pretty sure this was the former, but I couldn't have told you why I thought so. Just the set of his jaw, maybe, the way he didn't look at Summer when he answered her. We pushed through the prickly pear. The fissure was narrow enough that we had to go in sideways, one at a time, and it opened almost immediately into a small chamber. Not a cave exactly, more like a room the rock had made accidentally, maybe 15 feet across and 8 feet high, with a rough ceiling and a floor of packed dirt. Enough room to stand in, enough room to work in. Somebody had been working in it. There was a folding table against the far wall. Aluminum frame, canvas top, the kind you can get at any farm supply store. On the table, there was a dead headlamp and 3 empty Pioneer sample bags, the kind we used for soil and rock core samples. The bags were stained dark brown, almost black in the folds, and they were stiff with it. Whatever had been in them had dried in there. I didn't pick them up. I stood and looked at them for a moment and then looked at the rest of the room. Pinned to the rock wall above the table with a finishing nail was a hand-drawn topographic map. Pencil on graph paper, the lines close and careful, showing what looked like a cave system. Chambers, passages, elevation drops marked in neat numerals. The entrance to the system appeared to be directly below where we were standing. Somebody had surveyed this place. Somebody had done it carefully, and they had done it alone. And they had left all of this here. I picked up the headlamp. It was a standard field headlamp, the same model we all carried, and it was heavy in the way dead batteries make things heavy. I turned it over in my hand and looked at the battery housing. 2 initials scratched into the plastic with something sharp. SP. I held it for a moment, then I turned around and looked at Payne. He was already watching me. "That yours?" I asked. He didn't hesitate, not even a beat. "Preliminary survey, 14 months ago, give or take. I flagged this section as a possible karst feature and came out to take a look before we had the team together. Never logged it formally because it didn't pan out into anything worth reporting." He said it the way you say something you've said before, or at least thought through before. Smooth. Meant to come back for the bags, forgot. Summer looked at the table and then back at Payne and nodded, and that was enough for her. She was 26 and he was 54, and he had been doing this since before she was born, and that math worked on her the way it works on most people. It didn't work on me. Not because the explanation was impossible. Preliminary surveys happen. Unlogged notes happen. Forgotten gear happens. All of that is real. But the sample bags were stained with something, and the stain was dark, and the bags were stiff. And that's not what soil samples look like when they dry out. And Payne had volunteered for this assignment personally. And the initials were scratched in, not written with a marker, not labeled with tape. Scratched in with something sharp, the way you mark something you want to last. I didn't say any of that. I thought about it, standing there in that small rock room with the dead headlamp in my hand and the smell of old dust and something else underneath it, something organic and faint that I couldn't name. I thought about it and I decided not to say it. What I did instead was put the headlamp in my jacket pocket. Payne watched me do it. He didn't say anything about it. Map shows the entrance about 8 feet back from the south wall, he said, and turned toward the back of the chamber like the conversation was finished. We've got rope in the packs. Descent shouldn't be technical. Summer was already moving toward him, already pulling the topographic map off the wall to carry down with us, already trusting the man who had left his initials on a headlamp in a room he claimed to have forgotten about. I stood there another second. The headlamp sat heavy in my pocket. The stained bags sat on the table and I looked at them one more time. And then I followed. Because what else do? You follow. And you watch. And you keep what you know close until you understand what it means. The map showed a cave system 60 feet below us. Payne knew exactly where the entrance was without looking at the map again. I noticed that. I filed it. I went down. The rope was 50 feet, and I hit the bottom with a few feet to spare, which meant Payne's map was accurate to within about 10 feet. I didn't like knowing that. I unclipped and stepped back to give Summer room to land and swept my headlamp around the base of the shaft while I waited. And what I saw was the start of a passage, narrow at first, opening out into dark about 20 feet ahead. The air down here was different. Not bad exactly, just heavy. Still in a way that surface air never is, even on a windless day. Summer landed, then Payne. Payne coiled the rope without being asked and left it at the base of the shaft, organized, prepared. He'd done this before, and I already knew that. I filed it again anyway because I didn't have anything else to do with it yet. The passage opened up fast. 10 feet in, the ceiling jumped from maybe 5 feet to something I couldn't gauge. And then we walked out of the passage and into the chamber, and I stopped walking. I don't know how big it was. Big. The kind of space where you feel the air move differently around you, where your headlamp beam just stops being useful at a certain distance, and you're left with impressions instead of edges. What I could see clearly was the walls, and the walls were wrong. The coating was gray-white, uniform, covering everything from floor to ceiling in a layer maybe a quarter-inch thick in some places, thicker in others where it had built up into low ridges. I've seen cave formations. I've seen mineral deposits, calcium carbonate, the usual limestone work. This wasn't that. Mineral deposits have a structure to them, a geometry that comes from how crystals grow or how water moves. This stuff had no geometry. It looked like it had spread, like something had grown it the way you'd grow a culture in a lab dish. Except the dish was the entire interior surface of a room the size of a small warehouse. The texture, where my light hit it at an angle, was faintly fibrous, almost soft-looking. I crouched and touched the wall. It gave slightly. Not much, but enough. Like pressing on the skin of something. I stood back up fast. I didn't decide to do that. My legs just did it. "What is that?" Summer said. She wasn't asking me, she was just saying it. Payne said, "Biological deposit. Not uncommon in cave systems with significant organic activity." He said it like he was reading from a field manual. Like he'd said it before, maybe to himself, maybe to work out how it would sound. I looked at him. He was already moving toward the center of the chamber, headlamp sweeping the floor. And I thought, organic activity. That's a phrase that means something and nothing at the same time. I let it go and followed his light. The deer was in the middle of the chamber, white-tailed doe, I think, though it was hard to say because of what had been done to it. Split along the spine, clean, the two halves laid open like something had unzipped it. The ribs were gone, folded back. I couldn't tell which. What was left of the vertebrae had been scraped down to the bone, and the bone itself had parallel grooves pressed into it. Consistent spacing, consistent depth, running the full length of the spine. Not bite marks. Bite marks are irregular. They show hesitation. They show the jaw working. These were deliberate. They were the same marks Eliana Lee had described on the cattle femurs. And standing there looking at them, I understood something I hadn't fully understood when she described them over the phone. Whatever made these marks wasn't feeding. It was processing. I don't know why that distinction hit me as hard as it did. It just did. There's a difference between an animal killing something and eating it, and an animal killing something and working on it. The second one implies a purpose beyond hunger. I stood there too long looking at the grooves, and then Summer said my name, quiet, and I looked up. I swept my headlamp across the ceiling. 8 of them, pale, almost the same color as the biological film on the walls, which is probably why I hadn't seen them immediately. Pressed flat against the limestone, each one covering maybe 4 square feet of ceiling, limbs spread wide. I thought human-sized, and then immediately understood that was wrong. They were human-sized the way a hand tool is the right size to fit a human hand, meaning the size was functional, not coincidental. The proportions were off. The elbows bent the wrong way, hyperextended back toward the spine instead of forward, so that the arms made a shape that had no analog in anything I'd ever seen. The fingers, I kept my light on the hands for a moment. The fingers weren't fingers anymore, fused, broad flat pads, and the way they gripped the limestone was the way a suction cup grips glass. Total surface contact, no gap. They were motionless. They were looking at us. I knew that even though I couldn't make out anything on the faces from 60 feet below. I knew it the way you know when someone across a dark parking lot has turned to look at you. The attention was physical, you feel it. I said, "A pain." I don't know what I was going to say after that. I didn't get to say it. All 8 dropped at once. The sound they made hitting the floor wasn't what I expected, not a crash. More like a single dense impact, all of them landing in the same moment. And then they were moving, and the chamber was full of motion, and I lost track of individual shapes in the sweep of my headlamp. Payne ran. I registered that before I registered anything else. Payne ran immediately. No hesitation, no call back to us. And 3 of the shapes went after him into the passage toward the upper tunnel, which told me something I didn't have time to think about. Summer was 3 feet to my left. A 4th shape hit her from the right side, and she went down, and I was moving before she hit the ground, crossing the distance, and the thing had her left hand, both hands, both pads, wrapped around her wrist and hand, and it was pulling, and Summer was making a sound I don't want to describe. And I had the flare gun out. I carried the signal kit on my left hip. Standard field kit, 2 flares, single shot break action. I had it out, and I had the barrel against the side of the creature's head before I'd consciously decided to do it. The shape of its skull was wrong under the barrel tip, but I wasn't thinking about that. I fired. In an enclosed rock chamber 60 feet underground, a flare gun going off is not a small event. The detonation hit the walls and came back and hit me in the chest like a shove. I lost my footing for a second. The creature released Summer, and I couldn't see anything for a moment, just the afterimage of the flare burning white in my vision. And then my sight came back in pieces, and the creature was down, or gone. I couldn't tell which, and Summer was on the floor with her left arm pulled against her chest. I got to her and got a hand under her and pulled her upright, and she made a sound when I moved her wrist and I looked down, and I'm not going to go into detail about what her hand looked like. 2 fingers gone. The wrist was wrong, the angle was wrong, and when I shifted my grip to get her weight onto her feet, I could feel something in there that shouldn't be moving, grinding in a way that bone shouldn't grind. "I've got you," I said. "I've got you, stay with me." She nodded. She was breathing in short, controlled bursts, eyes wide, and she nodded. "That's Summer. That's exactly who she is." From below the chamber floor, from somewhere underneath us, deeper in the system, sound arrived. Not one source. Multiple. A low, rhythmic pressure, waves of it, coming from different directions at once, and getting louder. I stood there with Summer's weight against my side, and the flare gun empty in my hand, and I understood that whatever was in this cave, 8 of them had not been all of them. Not even close. We were maybe 40 feet from the shaft when I found it. Summer had her right arm across my shoulders, and I had my left arm around her waist, and we were moving the way you move when one person is doing most of the work and trying not to show it. Short steps, weight shifted, my headlamp throwing shadows that jumped every time I adjusted my grip. She wasn't making noise anymore. That was almost worse than when she had been. The sounds from below the chamber were coming in waves, and I was counting the seconds between them without meaning to. The way you count seconds between lightning and thunder when you're out in the brush and you want to know how much time you have. The notebook was wedged behind a limestone shelf, a natural fold in the rock where the tunnel bed left before it opened back into the passage we'd used on the way down. Small thing. Brown cover. Field survey size. The kind you can get at any supply outfit for about $3. I almost missed it. My headlamp caught the corner of it at the wrong angle, and I stopped walking because something in my brain registered the color before I consciously understood what I was looking at. "Hold on," I said. Summer leaned against the wall. She had her left arm pulled tight against her chest, and her jaw was set in a way that meant she was working very hard at something internal that had nothing to do with me. I reached past her and pulled the notebook free. The cover had Payne's handwriting on it. Not his initials this time. His full name, neat block letters, the way he labeled all his field equipment. I'd seen that handwriting on survey logs for 4 years. I opened it. The date on the first page was 14 months back. October. I know because I was doing a methane run north of Encinal in October of that year, and Payne had been listed as unavailable for 2 weeks, and the field office had given me a different senior contact for the duration. I hadn't thought about it since. I was thinking about it now. The sketches came first, 3 pages of them done in pencil with the kind of careful measurement notation that Payne was known for. The man could draft a site plan in the dark. That's not an exaggeration. He'd done it once on a flooding survey outside Laredo, and the measurements came back accurate to within 2 inches. These sketches were that quality. The upper chambers laid out in cross-section, ceiling heights marked, tunnel widths marked. The biological film on the walls noted in the margin with a question mark, and then a second notation that said, "Colony substrate, see entry." The main tunnel measured. The shaft measured. The depth to the lower chamber measured. He had been here before, not guessing, not estimating. He had been here and he had measured everything, and he had drawn it from memory or from notes, and he had put it all down on paper with the precision of a man who intended to use it again. I turned to the written entry. It was near the back, 1 page, and it was short. I'm not going to reproduce it word for word. I've gone over it enough times in my head that I could, probably, but I'm not going to. The substance of it was this: the colony was viable, meaning it was established and reproducing and not going anywhere. The upper chambers were accessible. The lower system extended further than he'd been able to map in a single entry. And then the last part, the part I've thought about more than anything else in the past however many months. A single line about the pioneer lease, about how the section of land above this cave system was under an active drilling lease, and how a federal biological hold triggered by a viable colony of unknown classification would freeze that lease indefinitely, and how that was not something that could be allowed to happen, and how this survey would therefore not be reported upward through the normal channels. That was it. That was the whole thing, written in the same neat block letters as his name on the cover. I stood there with Summer breathing against the wall beside me, and the sounds from below getting closer, and I held the notebook and I looked at it. 4 years. I had worked 4 years with Stephen Payne, and I had trusted him the way you trust somebody who has been in the field longer than you, and who has never given you a reason not to. He knew this country. He knew the rock and the brush and the limestone and the way the water moved through it. He'd been a good partner on every survey I'd run with him, steady and methodical, and not prone to the kind of corner cutting that gets people hurt. I had trusted him completely up until the moment I found his initials on a dead headlamp in a camp he'd told me he didn't remember building. And now I understood why he had volunteered for this survey, why he had asked for me by name and for Summer. He hadn't needed us for the surface work. He could have run a surface survey alone. He'd done it 100 times. He needed us for the descent. He needed a team, because going back down here alone, after whatever had happened to him 14 months ago, was something he wasn't willing to do. He needed to verify the depth. He needed to know how far down the lower system went, whether the colony had expanded, whether the drilling lease was still viable above it. He needed information, and he needed other people between himself and whatever was in the dark while he collected it. The creatures had not been surprised when we came down. I knew that now. I had felt it at the time, the stillness of them, the way they had watched us, the way the drop had been coordinated, and I had filed it under unknown behavior, unknown species, because I didn't have another category for it. But they had recognized pain. Whatever had happened 14 months ago, whatever encounter had produced that notebook, and those measurements and that single careful line about the lease, they had seen him before, and they remembered it. We had walked in behind a man they already knew. I don't know what that means exactly. I've thought about it, and I don't have a clean answer for it. I'm not sure I want one. I pocketed the notebook, same pocket as the headlamp. It felt heavy in a way that had nothing to do with its actual weight. "Okay," I said. "Let's go." Summer pushed off the wall and got her arm back across my shoulders, and we started moving again. She didn't ask what the notebook was. Maybe she'd seen me reading it. Maybe she hadn't. Either way, she didn't ask, and I didn't offer it. And we moved through the tunnel with my headlamp cutting the dark ahead of us and the sound from below coming in waves that were shorter now, the intervals tighter. And I kept my hand on Summer's side and kept my feet moving, and kept my eyes on the tunnel, and tried not to think too hard about what it meant that Payne had led us here on purpose. Tried not to think about the fact that he was still somewhere in this cave. Tried not to think about the fact that he had a pistol on his hip, and I had an empty flare gun and a rock hammer, and a notebook that could end his career and probably his freedom, and that he knew I had it, or would figure it out, because he was not a stupid man. The shaft was close. I could feel the air change, the faint, upward pull of it. 20 feet, maybe less. Summer's breathing had gone shallow and controlled again, and I matched my steps to hers and kept us moving toward the dark opening above and tried to focus on the one thing that still made sense. Get her out. Get her up. Get her to the surface. Everything else could wait until we were breathing open air. He was standing in the upper tunnel with the pistol already out, not drawn in a hurry, not like somebody who'd just made a decision, already out, arm at his side, barrel pointed at the floor. The way a man holds a tool he's been carrying for a while and knows exactly how to use. I came around the bend with Summer leaning into my left side, and I pulled up short, and she pulled up with me, and for a second, none of us moved. The headlamp caught the pistol first, then Payne's face. He looked tired mostly, not angry, not scared. Tired and settled in a way that was worse than either. I'd worked 4 surveys with Stephen Payne. I'd eaten lunch out of a cooler with him on a dozen different lease roads, listened to him talk about his daughter's soccer games, watched him work a transit level with the kind of quiet competence that makes you trust somebody without deciding to. You don't decide to trust a person like that. It just happens over time, the way you stop checking a bridge and just drive across it. I was thinking about that, which is not the right thing to be thinking about when a man has a pistol. "Zachary," he said. Just that, first. Like he was confirming I was there. Summer's breathing had changed behind me. I could feel her go still. Payne lifted his eyes to her and then back to me, and something moved across his face that I can't name cleanly. Not guilt, exactly, but something adjacent to it. Something that had already been decided past, and he wasn't going to revisit it now. He started talking. He was efficient about it, that's the word. He didn't pace, and he didn't raise his voice, and he didn't do any of the things a person does when they're talking themselves into something. He'd already talked himself into it. 14 months ago, probably. This was just the delivery. The flare had pushed the colony past the point of safe exit for a group our size. Those were his words. Safe exit. Like it was a logistics problem. The pioneer lease on this section of LaSalle County land was worth more than either of us, and he said that plainly, the way you state a number that's just a number. He was going to report our deaths as a cave-in. He'd report his own injuries, because he had them. I could see that now. A tear along his forearm, and the way he was favoring his right side, as injuries sustained in the same event. He'd been through the paperwork in his head already. I could tell by the order he laid it out. The sound from below came in while he was still talking. Longer waves now, but closer together, the intervals compressing, and I felt Summer's hand tighten on my arm. I want to be honest about what I was doing while Payne talked. I was listening to him, yes. I was also running the tunnel geometry in my head, measuring the distance between us, measuring the distance to the shaft. I was thinking about the notebook in my jacket pocket and whether it changed anything in the next 30 seconds, and I was thinking about Summer's hand, what was left of it, and whether she could grip a rope with her right arm alone if she had to. I was doing all of that in the background while the front of my brain just stood there and looked at Payne and let him finish. He finished. I said, "Okay." He blinked, just slightly. I reached back over my shoulder and unclipped the rock hammer from where it was strapped to Summer's pack. I'd taken it off her rig an hour ago to free up her movement, clipped it to mine without thinking much about it. It was a good hammer. Estwing, straight handle, about 14 ounces. I'd used one like it for 3 years, and I knew exactly how it sat in my hand. I swung it once, low and hard, across the back of his knuckles. The sound it made was not good. Payne made a sound too, short, involuntary, the kind a person makes when their body answers before their mind does. And the pistol hit the cave floor and spun a few inches and stopped. I picked it up. My hand was shaking. I noticed that and filed it away. The 3 of us stood there. Payne was bent slightly forward, cradling his right hand against his chest, and he was breathing through his teeth, and the sound from below was coming in shorter now, and Summer was still holding my arm, and I had the pistol, and no clear idea what I was supposed to do with the next 10 seconds. Payne straightened up slowly. He looked at his hand first, then at me. Not at the pistol, at me. I don't know how long we stood there. Not long. 15 seconds, maybe. It felt longer because of the sound. Then something changed in his face. Not the tired look. That stayed. Something underneath it shifted, like a door opening into a room he'd had locked off for a while. He looked at Summer and then back at me, and when he spoke again, his voice was different. Not softer, exactly. Quieter. Less rehearsed. "Take her and go," he said. That was all. I stood there another second. I was waiting for the rest of it. The condition, the negotiation, the angle. There wasn't one. He just looked at me with that unlocked thing in his face and said it again, quieter. "Go, Zachary." I understood it then. Not all of it, not the full shape of what he was deciding, but enough. He'd made a different kind of calculation now, standing in the dark with his hand broken and the sound coming up from below and the notebook already in my pocket. Some things you can't walk back to the surface from. He knew that. He'd known it longer than I had. I looked at him for another second. I thought about saying something. I couldn't find anything that was worth the time it would take to say it. I held the pistol out to him. He took it with his left hand. His right was already swelling. I could see it even in the headlamp light. The knuckles going dark and wrong. He took the pistol and he held it loose at his side, and he looked at me one more time with that quiet thing in his face and nodded once. I turned around. I got Summer's good arm over my shoulder and I got my arm around her ribs and I started moving her toward the shaft. I did not look back. That's not me being hard about it or making a point of something. I just didn't look back. The shaft was close, and Summer was heavy against my side, and the sound from below was tightening up, and I had one job left, and it was the only thing I could afford to think about. Get her to the shaft, get her up, get her to the surface. That's what I did. The methane sensor had been reading elevated since the first landing. I know that now. I knew it then, too, in the way you know something when you're too busy to stop and deal with it. Filed it somewhere in the back and kept moving because there were 8 things on the ceiling and Summer was bleeding and pain was whatever pain was, and the number on the sensor wasn't critical yet. Just elevated, just worth noting. I noted it. I kept moving. That's the honest version. By the time I got Summer to the base of the entrance shaft, the reading had climbed another 4 points and I couldn't file it anymore. The shaft was a narrow limestone chimney, maybe 3 feet across at the base. The walls rough enough to get purchase on if you knew how to work them. I'd come down at 60 feet with a rope assist and a working headlamp and both hands free. I was going up it with a woman who couldn't use her left arm at all, and whose whole body was starting to go slack in a way that told me shock was setting in hard. I needed a minute to think about how to do that. I needed to not take a minute because the sound from below the chamber was still moving. I set Summer down against the wall. She made a sound when I did it, low and involuntary, not quite a word. And I turned the sensor toward the base of the shaft to see what it was reading at ground level. Higher. A lot higher. I swept the headlamp along the wall and found it almost immediately. A crack in the limestone, maybe 8 inches long and 2 fingers wide, running diagonal from about knee height down to the floor. You couldn't hear the seep, but you could feel it if you put your hand near enough. A faint push of cooler air that wasn't moving the way cave air moves. It was coming from somewhere pressurized, somewhere below, and it had been bleeding into the cave system the whole time we were down here. 3 years running methane surveys for Pioneer, and I can tell you that an 8-inch crack in a limestone formation above a natural gas deposit is not a small problem. The gas itself is odorless. Pioneer adds the mercaptan so you can smell it in a residential line, but down here it's just gas, just accumulating, just waiting for a heat source. The sensor was telling me the concentration at floor level was getting toward the lower end of the flammable range. Not there yet. Getting there. I looked at the crack for a second. I looked at the shaft above me. I looked at Summer, who had her eyes open but wasn't quite tracking. I had 1 flare left. The signal kit had come with 3. I'd fired 1 in the chamber, 1 had gone with pain, and the last one was still clipped to the outside of the kit on my belt. A road flare, basically. Burns at around 1,000 degrees, slow and sustained, designed to be seen from a distance, not designed to be left burning against a gas seep in an enclosed limestone cave. I unclipped it. I want to be clear that I understood what I was doing. I wasn't confused about it. Wasn't acting on instinct without thinking it through. I thought it through. It took about 4 seconds, and I thought it through completely. Pain was behind us in the tunnel. Whatever was below the chamber was moving. The shaft was 60 feet of vertical climbing, with Summer Parker barely conscious against my side. And the crack in the wall was going to keep bleeding gas into the cave whether I did anything about it or not. I broke the flare against the rock face about 6 inches above the crack. It caught on the second strike, sputtering orange, and I wedged the burning end into a natural pocket in the limestone where it would sit without falling. The flame was small and steady. I watched it for a moment. The sensor reading ticked up another point. I had maybe 15 minutes, I thought. Maybe less. Probably less. Summer. I crouched in front of her. Her eyes came to my face. I need you to work with me. Can you do that? She looked at her left hand. What was left of it? She'd had it wrapped against her chest since the chamber, and she hadn't looked at it directly until just then. Or if she had, she hadn't let on. Now she looked at it, and something moved across her face that I didn't know what to call. Yeah, she said. Her voice was steady, which surprised me. Yeah, okay. I got her good arm over my shoulder, and I got my back under her weight, and I started up the shaft. The first 20 feet weren't bad. The limestone was rough and irregular, good footholds, good friction, and Summer was doing what she could. Pushing with her legs, keeping her weight centered, not fighting me. I had both hands working the wall, and I could feel my grip was solid. I told myself it was manageable. I was wrong, but I told myself that. The middle section was where the shaft narrowed, maybe 2.5 feet across, the walls pressing in, and I had to angle Summer differently to get us both through it. She made that sound again when I shifted her. I didn't have anything to say about it. I just kept moving. Somewhere below us, 3 shots fired. Not close, not in the shaft. Somewhere back in the tunnel system, deeper, the sound coming up through the rock more than through the air. 3 distinct reports with maybe a second between each one, and then nothing. Payne's pistol. I knew the sound of it from when I'd held it. That particular flat crack that 9mm makes in an enclosed space. 3 rounds. Then silence. I did not stop climbing. I want to say something about that, about not stopping. I've turned it over a lot in the months since. The thing is, there wasn't a decision to make. Stopping wouldn't have changed what those shots meant. And stopping would have cost us the time we had left. And Payne had told me to go. He told me to go, and I'd gone, and I was going, and that was the agreement we'd made in the tunnel without either of us saying it out loud. 3 shots, and then silence was not information I could act on. It was just information. So I kept climbing. The last 20 feet were bad. My arms were shaking. Not trembling. Shaking. The kind of full muscle failure that starts in the shoulders and works down through the forearms and ends up in your hands, so that your grip feels like it belongs to someone else. Summer had gone quieter, which scared me more than the sounds she'd been making. I couldn't tell if she was conserving herself or going somewhere I couldn't follow. I kept talking. I don't remember what I said. Something about the surface. Something about almost there. The kind of thing you say when you need the other person to stay present and you don't have anything real to offer them. My left hand slipped once. Just slipped. Lost the hold. And for 1 second, my whole weight went to my right arm. And Summer's weight went with it. And I thought that was it. That was where we were going to be. 60 feet underground, with a burning flare against a gas seep below us. I found the hold again. I don't know how. I found it. And I got my feet under me, and I kept going. We came out of the shaft at 3:14 in the morning. I know the time because my watch face hit the limestone lip at the top of the shaft, and I looked at it automatically, the way you do, and the numbers were right there. 3:14. The sky above us was that deep blue black that's almost purple. No moon left. Stars everywhere the way they get out in LaSalle County when there's nothing between you and them. The air hit my face, and I could smell the caliche and the dry grass and the faint diesel smell that drifts off the lease roads even when there's no truck nearby. And I remember thinking that was the best smell I'd ever encountered in my life, which is maybe not saying much, but it's what I thought. I got Summer to flat ground, and I set her down on the limestone shelf above the shaft opening, and I sat down next to her because my legs weren't going to hold me for another 30 seconds, and I knew it. She was breathing. I could see her chest moving. Her eyes were open, and she was looking at the sky. We sat there. I don't know how long. Not long. The ground moved. Not an earthquake. Nothing like that. A single low concussion that came up through the rock and into my boots and up through my spine. A pressure wave more than a sound. And the limestone outcropping above the shaft pushed a curtain of pale dust out from its face and then settled. The mesquite around us shook once and went still. A nighthawk flushed from somewhere in the brush, gone before I could track it. Then nothing. The cave below us was silent. I sat there with my hands on my knees, and I looked at the shaft opening, and I looked at the dust still drifting off the limestone face, and I did not go back. I want to be honest about that too. I thought about it for maybe 2 seconds. Not to go back for pain. I knew what 3 shots and then silence meant. But just the automatic pull of it, the thing in you that says you should check, you should be sure. I sat with that for 2 seconds, and then I let it go. The flare I'd left burning against that crack had done what I'd left it there to do. Whatever was below us wasn't moving anymore. The cave was quiet in a way that felt permanent, not like something pausing. Summer said, "Is it over?" I looked at her. Her face was pale under the starlight, the left arm still held against her chest, her eyes steady on mine. "Yeah," I said. "It's over." I don't know if I believed that when I said it. I think I believed the part that mattered, the part about getting her out, the part about the 3 shots and the concussion and the silence. The rest of it, whether anything down there had survived, whether the seep was sealed or just blocked, whether 60 feet of limestone was enough, that I didn't know. I said it was over because Summer Parker needed to hear that it was over, and because she'd earned a true answer to the extent I had one to give her. That was the extent I had. I got to my feet. My arms were still shaking. I got Summer upright, got her weight against me, and I started walking us toward where we'd left the truck. The drive to Laredo took an hour and 40 minutes. I know that because I checked the clock when we hit the highway, and I checked it again when I pulled into the emergency bay. And somewhere in between I had stopped thinking in any organized way and was just driving. Summer was in the passenger seat with her left arm across her lap and her right hand pressed over what was left of the wrist, and she didn't say much, and I didn't ask her to. The bleeding had slowed. I didn't know if that was good or bad. I'm not a medic. I knew enough to keep pressure on it and keep her awake and get to the hospital, and that's what I did. She asked me once if I thought pain had made it out. I kept my eyes on the road. "No," I said. She didn't say anything to that. Neither did I. They took her back fast, which I was grateful for, and then I was standing in a waiting room under fluorescent lights with dry blood on my hands and caliche dust on my boots and no particular idea what to do with myself. I found a bathroom and ran the water until it went cold and stood there watching it circle the drain. My arms had stopped shaking somewhere around mile marker 40 on the highway. The rest of me hadn't caught up yet. Summer went into surgery around 6 in the morning. The attending physician, a short, tired-looking woman who introduced herself as Dr. Reyes, came out to tell me what they were dealing with before they started. 2 fingers already gone. The wrist collapsed, she said, meaning the carpal bones were fractured in a pattern she described carefully, and I didn't follow past the first sentence. The tissue damage extended further than the initial presentation suggested. They were going to take the hand at the wrist. I said, "Does she know?" She consented, Dr. Reyes said. She was lucid enough. I sat back down. I looked at the wall for a while. There's a particular quality to waiting room walls in hospitals. That specific off-white that isn't quite any color. And I spent probably 20 minutes looking at it without seeing it. Summer Parker was 26 years old, and she'd come on this survey because Payne had requested her by name, same as me, and she'd done her job well, and she'd trusted the people she was supposed to trust, and now she was in surgery, losing her hand. That's the part I kept coming back to. Not the cave, not the creatures, not any of it. Just that she'd done everything right, and it hadn't mattered. Dr. Reyes came back out a little before 9. The surgery had gone as expected, she said, which I understood to mean as planned rather than as hoped. Summer was stable. She'd be in recovery for several hours. I could see her after that. I thanked her. I went and got coffee from a machine down the hall. I drank it standing up. The incident report took me 4 days to write. 11 pages. I've written a lot of field reports in my time, and most of them run 2, maybe 3 pages if something genuinely unusual happened. And I sat at my kitchen table for 4 days and wrote 11 pages, and I still don't think I got it right. Not because I lied. I didn't lie exactly. I just described what happened in the language available to me, which was the language of geological surveys and field safety protocols and equipment failure, and I used that language to build a structure that was true in its individual pieces and something else entirely when you stood back and looked at the shape of it. Payne's death, a cave-in during an emergency geological survey, consistent with the seismic event recorded at 3:14 a.m. by the monitoring equipment at the Cotulla Field Station. Summer Parker's injury, sustained during the emergency egress following the cave-in. Equipment loss, consistent with rapid unplanned evacuation. Cause of the cave-in, undetermined, possibly gas-related given the methane readings logged by my sensor throughout the descent. That last part was true. Everything was true. That's the thing about a report like that. You don't have to lie if you're careful about what you choose to say. The pioneer safety coordinator who collected it was a man named Hartley, or that's what his badge said. He sat across from me in a conference room at the Cotulla field office, and he took the report, and he set it on the table in front of him, and he asked me to walk him through the sequence of events. I did. He asked 3 follow-up questions, all procedural, all about equipment and timing. He wrote things down. He never once looked me in the eye. Not once, the whole interview. He looked at his notepad. He looked at the report. He looked at the table. He looked at the wall behind my left shoulder. I watched him do it, and I understood that this wasn't discomfort. This was practice. He had done this before, or something enough like it, that he'd learned how to sit in a room with someone and collect a statement without making the kind of eye contact that becomes a thing you remember later. I signed the report. I drove home. I sat in my driveway for a while before I went inside. 6 weeks after that, Pioneer closed the lease on that section of LaSalle County land. No announcement, no explanation to the field office. Just a notice that the lease had been administratively terminated and the survey contract on that section was concluded. I heard about it from a colleague who worked the adjacent grid. He thought it was a budget decision. Maybe a regulatory issue, he said. These things happen. I didn't correct him. That's when I understood what I was dealing with. Not in terms of the creatures. I'd understood that part, or as much of it as I was going to. But in terms of the company, Pioneer's response to what happened out there wasn't confusion. It wasn't an investigation, it was management. Someone above Hartley had looked at the situation and made a calculation, and the calculation had come out in favor of closing the lease quietly and moving on, which meant someone above Hartley knew enough to make that calculation, which meant Payne hadn't been working alone in what he knew. I thought about that for a long time. I'm still thinking about it. 6 months after the cave, I drove back out to the Chaparral Wildlife Management Area. I'm not entirely sure why. I told myself I needed to see it, needed to confirm the shaft was sealed, needed something concrete to stand on instead of just the memory of a concussion moving through limestone at 3 a.m. Maybe that was true. Maybe I just needed to go back the way you sometimes need to go back to a place where something happened, even when going back doesn't change what happened. I parked where we'd parked that night and walked out to the limestone outcropping in the early afternoon heat. Mesquite scrub on both sides of me, a mockingbird going through its repertoire somewhere off to my left. The shaft entrance was sealed, collapsed inward, the limestone around it fractured and settled. It looked like a cave-in. It looked exactly like what the report said it was. I crouched down at the base of the outcropping and ran my hand along the rock face. 3 parallel gouges, pressing outward from below. Each one maybe 4 inches long, spaced the way I remembered, the width of those fused flat pads I'd watched grip the ceiling 60 feet underground. The edges of the gouges were pale, fresh limestone, not weathered, not dusted over. Recent. The caliche hadn't settled back into them yet. I stayed crouched there for a while. The mockingbird kept going. The heat came off the rock in slow waves. A cave-in doesn't make marks like that. A cave-in doesn't press outward from below in parallel lines at consistent spacing. I know what geological pressure does to limestone, and I know what it doesn't do. And what it doesn't do is leave grooves that match the hands of something I watched drop from a ceiling in the dark. Whatever had been down there had survived. The flare, the seep, the concussion, all of it. And it was moving up. I walked back to the truck, got in, closed the door and sat there with the windows down and the engine off, looking at the scrub. The methane sensor was on the passenger seat where I'd left it. I'd been running it in the truck out of habit since that night. The way you pick up a habit when the alternative is not knowing. Its reading wasn't 0. It had been running a low positive since I'd pulled off the highway, climbing gradual as I got closer to the outcropping. And it was sitting now at a number that wasn't alarming on its own, but that I knew the context of. The seep was still active. Whatever I'd done to the colony 6 months ago, I hadn't sealed the gas, and I hadn't stopped the movement. I'd bought time. That's all. I started the engine. Summer Parker lived in Cotulla now, had moved back after the surgery and the rehab, was working a desk position with a county land office. She'd told me that when I'd visited her in Laredo 3 months back. She'd looked steadier than I expected. She'd asked me straight out if I thought it was over. The same question she'd asked me on the surface that night, and I'd given her the same answer I'd given her then. And she'd looked at me the same way she'd looked at me then, like she was deciding whether to push on it. She hadn't pushed, but she hadn't let it go either. I could tell. I pulled onto the county road and pointed the truck toward Cotulla. 40 minutes. Maybe a little more. The sensor held its reading on the seat beside me, steady and patient, the way instruments are when they're just reporting what's true and leaving the rest to you. Summer had been there. She'd seen the ceiling, seen what dropped, felt what it did to her hand. She was the only other person alive who had been in that cave and come back out. And whatever I was going to do next, whatever that even meant, whatever came after writing a report and watching a company quietly fold a lease and driving out alone to crouch in the heat and run my fingers along fresh gouges and limestone, I couldn't start it alone. You can't prove something like this alone. You can't even think it through alone. Not really. Not without someone who was there to tell you that you're not losing your mind. That it happened the way you remember it happening. She was alive. She was 40 minutes away. That was where I had to start. I drove.